Hello! It's time again for another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, Issues in Science Education, Part 10. It's theory. It's not fact. Sit back and relax and enjoy today's edition of the Daily Bolt. So, this is the penultimate podcast in this series on science education and, in some respects, education in general. And for those of you who don't know what penultimate means, it means it's the next to last. So I'm going to wrap it up with the next podcast after this one. This one, however, tackles a topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart and kind of a pet peeve. And it's a pet peeve because it has so many implications if it's not handled correctly. And that's the difference between theory and fact in science. And some of you out there listening to this, my colleagues, you do a great job in presenting what it means for something to be a scientific theory, which is almost everything in science. Some of you do a piss-poor job, and I end up finding later in life, whether it's teaching in college level or just even in talking with people, that they think something which is only theory is 100% die-hard in-the-wool fact. And it's not. Because in science, this is a point I've mentioned before, and I'll mention as many times as it takes to sink in, very little can be 100% proven without any doubt, without any uncertainty. Because our theories are based on the data that we have. The data that we have is almost always necessarily incomplete. There may be a big body of evidence, but it isn't necessarily complete, and it only takes one strong counterexample to throw the theory well into question. 11 podcasts ago, when I restarted this series, actually it's less than 11, 10 podcasts ago, I talked about Boaty McBoatface and the fact that the observations there revealed processes in the deep ocean that we had no idea were going on. And they don't fit in any existing theory. So we have to change the theory to meet the new facts if those facts are strong enough. And in that particular case, they certainly were. There were many observations that supported this whole set of deep ocean processes, this turbulence that we didn't know was going on and isn't accounted for in any ocean or climate model. So this goes back to anything we know in science that we really have to call a theory, and that is most everything in science. Because there's always the chance, unless you've repeated the observations, the experiments, the conditions perfectly, thousands and 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 maybe millions and millions of times, you can't really say that you have 100% proof. There's always some degree of uncertainty. And this applies to many scientific principles that, unfortunately, way too many people don't treat as theories, but they treat as facts. And then they try to do things like make policy on them. They try to proselytize on them or not proselytize. And it has, unfortunately, misinformed much of public discourse that relates to scientific concepts. Let me give you two examples that will be sure to probably get some of you fired up, if not all of you, by the time we're done. And that's okay, because this topic fires me up all the time when I see it taught very poorly. Example number one, evolution. Evolution is a theory that was proposed by Charles Darwin that fit the available observations at the time, and it still fits most observations we have of biological processes. Are there things we can't explain by evolution? Yes, in terms of biology. There are some conditions that have occurred in various organisms, whether it be unexpected mutations in plants, people, whatever, that don't fit under the original theory of evolution. And in fact, Darwin's theory has been modified and remodified to fit new facts, new data, a number of times since he proposed it. It's not quite the same theory that he originally started with, and it doesn't necessarily rule out other possibilities. In fact, there are ways in which evolution can be very compatible with a creationist viewpoint. I'm not going to go into those now, but I will tell you that during this last year, and I've heard this before, I was strongly cautioned about trying to do anything other than teach straight evolution because it is what the parents think is a fact. And the parents get upset if you teach them something that doesn't teach the kids something that they think is not a fact. And so I had to muzzle myself and muzzle my perspective because of the risk that these parents would do what they've done with another teacher who had tried bringing in a different perspective before, and the parents didn't go to the principal. They didn't go to the superintendent. They went straight to the school board. And the school board threw a hissy fit. And that it passed down, and it was basically decreed that you will teach only evolution, and you will teach evolution as if it were fact. And I admit I did not 100% comply with that. I did not state what my views were. I did state that there were other possible views, which is good because I had a couple of students in my class that really thought that evolution was a load of crap. And they weren't going to listen to me teach it in any way, shape, or form. And the only way I was going to get through to them was to make them understand that there can be multiple perspectives and everything is still actually correct. Because in science, evolution is a theory. That means it isn't 100% proven, and it can be modified as new data come in. So what my views on the subject are is a subject for another podcast. But I just wanted to bring it up as one possible example. Because sometimes I have run into college students who have effectively been taught that evolution was 100% ironclad fact. There can be no other interpretation. Any interpretation, particularly those from a spiritual or faith-based perspective, is wrong and full of bunk. And it's caused, closed-mindedness. You can't have closed-mindedness when you look at science, or else you really never allow yourself to see the possibilities that might exist in the world and the universe. And with that brings me to example number 2, climate and climate change. There is a school of thought and a school of teaching that I have seen pushed by science teachers who themselves are convinced, and it's fine. They're allowed to have their own opinion, as am I, and I'm not going to tell you at the moment what my own opinion is. But nonetheless, as we talked about in a previous podcast, in which it's awfully hard at times for a teacher's biases or beliefs to not translate down into their teaching, this is one of the more common current examples where a science teacher is 100% convinced based on whatever data they've looked at. And sometimes that's very, very, very little. They are convinced that all climate change is man-induced, which does not fit with the available theories. The available theories allow for anthropogenic or human-induced climate change, but there are other possible causes as well, causes that have been researched for now almost 140 years at least, maybe longer than that. I'm just thinking of the earliest studies that I know of that came out of the Russian school in the late 19th century. Regardless, it's a theory. These are all theories. We get new data all the time. And that new data, if you want to be an honest scientist about it, really has to be taken into account unless you can prove that there were experimental issues with the data. The experiment was not conducted properly. The data is bad and should not be used in terms of interpreting a theory or even modifying it. Now, that criteria applies to everything. That can apply to studies that suggest strong human-caused climate change, and it can be applied to studies that suggest there's no human-caused climate change. I mentioned in a podcast a couple of days ago that there's this new study from a Finnish group that suggests that there is no human-caused component of climate change. I haven't looked at this study yet, so I'm not going to evaluate it. There are scientists out there that immediately dismiss it without even looking at the study, without studying what they did and whether or not there were flaws in the approach or the reasoning. They just automatically assume that it doesn't fit with their view, and so it has to be wrong, it has to be bad. And some of these people are some of the people that teach your children, whether it's in K through 12 or probably mostly in the community college university ranks. And that's bad. They have ceased to be good scientists because they just automatically throw studies out of hand that don't fit their worldview. And then they teach their worldview as it were fact and not theory. And so we have generations. Now, a couple generations, I would say, easily, that have gone through K through 12 and college, that have an overwhelming orientation towards all climate change being human-caused, when that is not the case. It's a theory, and a few studies that backed that theory have been taught as fact. And now we have people trying to make policy in the government at various levels that believe that even when they've been taught wrong. They've been taught wrongly that theory is fact and it's incontrovertible. And it's one reason we have so much acrimony today on some of these topics, like climate change. And it even goes to a very different level in terms of many of the things that I have talked about in this entire series of podcasts. In the 1960s, there were a series of studies that were considered groundbreaking with respect to educational theory and practice. And if you go through some of the educational literature, and I can't say I've gone through all of it, I can say I've only gone through a small portion of it, but I see many, many references back to this relatively small subset of studies by a small subset of people. And in the few papers that I've read, those studies are basically treated by the authors doing the new study as fact. And, okay, based on this study, this is a fact. Now we're going to propose this, which is more theory. So theory became fact, was taught as fact, and now leads to new theory, even though it's really just kind of a house of cards in a certain way, in that one study might be able to undo all of this. But again, there is a mindset that has been taught where basically what were studies in educational theory were assumed to be fact, taught that way, and now it's very, very difficult to reverse course. And so, of all the problems and all the issues in science education I've talked about in this series of podcasts, this, in some ways, is the most fundamental, it is the most heinous, and it is the one that disappoints me the most with the current generation of researchers and teachers. They don't question enough. They assume theory as fact, teach it as dogma, and now we see the result in what's becoming an increasingly chaotic and divisive and uncivil public discourse environment. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about things on one side of the political aisle or another. This happens in every perspective. Just different ones for different issues. And different perspectives, different dogma in different parts of the country. It's no wonder we have such a mess. That's all for this edition of the Daily Bolt. I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. We'll conclude this series tomorrow with, hopefully, a little optimism. But for now, good night, good morning, good afternoon, and God bless.